welcome to Nas Trilhas da Razão. I'm here today with Lee McIntyre. Lee is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University and a recent lecturer in ethics at Harvard Extension School. Lee holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and among other books, Lee is the author of Truth Killers, How to Talk to a Science Denier, The Scientific Attitude, Post-Truth, and Respecting Truth, and Dark Ages. Lee is also author of several fiction books. Thank you very much, Lee, for being with us today, sharing your time and your knowledge. And let us start talking about your background. You're a philosopher of science who has written extensively about topics such as the nature of science and pseudoscience, truth, post-truth, science denial, and related subjects. How did you get interested in studying science?
My interest in science really goes back to my childhood. My brother is 13 years older than me, and we shared a room for, felt like a day and a half before he was off to college. And when he left for college, he left behind all of his books and his microscope and his chemistry set in this bench in our room. And that was always very attractive to me, to look at that stuff and think about it. He didn't go on to be a scientist, but that was kind of inspiring for me. And then I started, once I was old enough to start to read, I remember from a very early age, my dad told me that the best education you could get in life is to read the encyclopedia. We had the World Book Encyclopedia, and I started to read that. And I was very fascinated with the Dark Ages and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the ancient Greek philosophers and Newton and Galileo and just all the people in history who had made a difference. And so I always admired science. And then for a little while I thought of becoming a scientist, but that wasn't really my calling. I wanted to understand what was special about science and to defend it from people who were attacking it, because it sort of outraged me when I got old enough to figure out, I was reading the encyclopedia and understanding that sometimes they send, Giordano Bruno to the stake and, they do terrible things to resist science, but that's all in the past. But then you get to be an adult and you realize that, well, that may be in the past, but science denial is not in the past. And so as a philosopher, I wanted to do something about it. I didn't want to just continue to write for other people with PhDs in philosophy. I wanted to write for everybody, to defend science and to figure out what was so special about it. And what do you do then? You define it against what it's not, like pseudoscience or science denial. So that was really what got me there. Science has always seemed to me to be a really rare thing, this humanity at its best, when we're able to admit we might be wrong and let's check.
Yeah, that's great. Humanity at its best. I also think it's a very interesting way to talk about science. Mm-hmm. Lee, what you said is linked to an interview you have on your website. There is, I copied a passage of that. Mm-hmm. You said, somewhere along the line, when I was about 8 years old, at the height of the Vietnam War, I started wondering why the world was such an awful place. I remember asking my mother about this, and she gave me a great answer. She said, I don't know the answer to that question, but somewhere at the great universities right now, I'll bet there are scholars who are studying that very question. And then you say, how could I not want to become a professor after that? Is the feeling of having an impact on the lives of other people, as you said some seconds ago, and solving problems, what keeps you interested in communicating ideas for the general public?
Yeah, and thank you for the quotation. Remind me of my mom there. Yes, because my earliest vision of professors is that that's what they did. I thought, who else in life has the time and the education, and the freedom to work on the world's problems. And then you go into academics and you figure out that it's like that for a few people, but for many, many people, it's quite small and, on purpose. And that was a great disappointment to me. I mean, I loved philosophy, but it was really when I started graduate school and started to take all these courses on these tiny, tiny little problems that I started to wonder, what is this going to make a difference for people? And I'm not denigrating basic research or my fellow philosophers. I'm just saying that for me, I wanted to focus on the things where I could have a practical influence. And that fit very well with my interest in defending science, because you don't have to really go into philosophy of science very long before you figure out that, I mean, back when I was starting out, the evolution deniers were just tragic. What, you know, how could they not understand the importance of evolution? How could they, you know, be so obtuse about it? And then, of course, science denial is the gift that keeps on giving. After that, well, there's anti-vax, there's flat earth, there's climate denial. I mean, just the science denial keeps piling up. So I've had more and more work to do. And the fun part for me is that I feel like I'm making a contribution to what I wanted to do when I was a little boy. And I'm not sure many people get to say that. And that's kind of fun for me to feel like that fits.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Lee, you started writing about science denial with Dark Ages. When was like your first book or first paper that you wrote about this topic?
Oh boy.
Respecting Truth is also about this.
Yeah, Respecting Truth is about that more than Dark Ages, but Dark Ages was really my breakout book. That was the one that I wrote in secret. I was up for tenure. And that book was not going to count for tenure because it was a trade book, a practical book. And so we had this wonderful little apartment upstairs, you know, with one of those roofs that slants down, you know, so it's kind of like the little monk's carol. And I wrote that, and I was ahead on my peer-reviewed articles, and I wrote that book in secret. And I was going to publish it after I got tenure. But that was my, you know, that was going to be my break. And then after that, I sort of thought, but that's what I really want to do. That's the kind of writing that I want to do. And so that, I mean, that wasn't the first time I'd started to think about science denial, but that was the first time that I really engaged in a public way in writing with the sort of problems that philosophers thought about, but written in language that you didn't have to be a philosopher to understand. That was the challenge, because, you know, for all the philosophers' respect for Wittgenstein, who says, you know, whatever can be said clearly, for all the respect for analytical philosophy and the, you know, the positivists and all this emphasis on clarity, I think that philosophers are sometimes suspicious when it's too clear. Sometimes people, I think, feel that if it has to be obtuse, it has to be difficult, it has to be, you know, in language that mere mortals can't understand in order to be important. But my feeling was, if you can't express it clearly, you don't really understand it. And of course, that leaves you open to attack. And in academic writing, it's like building a brick wall, because somebody's going to attack you. And I have to admit, Dark Ages is still a little bit like that. But as I've written over the years, I've realized more and more, you don't have to write like that. I mean, people will attack you, and that's why I always have a lot of footnotes. But I like to, I'm a little more expansive now and creative, I hope, in writing, because I want to get people interested that are not philosophers.
And Lee, perhaps you talked about obscurity. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why postmodern philosophy is so famous in certain circles.
Yes.
I studied in Brazil. I live in Brazil, and the departments of humanities and even science education departments are filled with people who follow postmodern authors. And sometimes it's even difficult, if not impossible, to comprehend. You get a text or a book about them. Perhaps even the author does not understand what he or she wrote. It's difficult to follow an argument, and perhaps people, as you said, they value these kind of writings because they are very obscure, difficult to understand.
Yeah. Derrida admitted that at one point. At one point, he embraces that. So you got to give him points for honesty, right? He's actually one of the more interesting, I think, of the folks. No, I mean, I have this chapter that I probably get more hate mail about than anything else and anything I've ever written, which is chapter 6 in Post-Truth, where I basically argue that postmodernism is one of the roots of post-truth. And people don't like that. And all I really argued there was that, you know, if you attack science, yeah, well, let me put it this way. If you claim that there's no such thing as objective truth, that all truth is merely a reflection of power relationships, then you have to explain science. I mean, you either have to explain why science is an exception to that, or you have to go the whole way and explain why science isn't really a search for truth. Science is really just this hierarchical structure of political power, et cetera, et cetera. And that, I think, is wrong. And I've got arguments for why I think it's wrong. But I mean, that's the debate, isn't it? That's, you know, what we should get into. But a lot of the pushback is not, I want to be careful. I don't want to say it's not good faith. It's hard because people break into different camps and then they get polarized and they don't like one another. And I mean, it's hard for me not to see some of that work, you know, the relativism, the postmodernism, as an attack on something that I love so dearly, which is science. And so, you know, I do defend science against claims like that. And I mean, even when it is really interesting because some people have made the claim that, no, you really need to understand postmodernism to understand post-truth. And I say, yeah, that's right. But they say, no, I mean, in a good way, right? That we anticipated it. Study us, we're the ones who led the way. That I think is actually quite interesting. And I, you know, would enjoy those sorts of debates. But it's, how to put it? It's so shot through with politics. And it seems to me like some of it is that I'm saying, oh no, you people on the left, you're really responsible for what happened with post-truth on the right. It's like you invented this tool that was this weapon that was so fierce that, and you left it on the battlefield. And then it got picked up by Karl Rove and Donald Trump, and they used it for their own purpose. And I think you kind of have to own that. You have to at least say, I'm sorry. And there is some evidence that, you know, some folks in that camp have said, you know, I'm sorry. One of the people that I find the most interesting in this debate is Bruno Latour, because he gave one of the most full kind of mea culpas about, you know, was he wrong? Was he behind this problem of, you know, people attacking climate change, people saying, you know, behind climate denial, and was his work questioning whether there could be objective truth behind this? And then he had this moment of saying, you know, mea culpa, but then he took it all back. Then he took it all back to say, oh, no, if you read my work really carefully, you see that I was on the right side all along and that I was pointing the way and, you know, indicating the problems that you were going to have later. So I don't know. It's a difficult debate, you know, and I have it with my fellow humanists sometimes in, you know, English and literary criticism. But it's I'm comfortable with which side I'm on in the science wars. I'm very much pro-science.
Yes, and I have really the same impression because when I studied for my PhD, for example, even before when I was an undergraduate and I read philosophy of science in Brazil, many authors or postmodern authors were indicated for us to read, and Latour was one of them.
Yes,
and I usually wondered why. Someone who was, in my opinion, clearly had a very negative view of science, or a very suspicious, he was very suspicious about science. How could a person with that profile could could be teaching us about how science works or something like that.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard because if you look back at the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the people who were pro-science, pro-reason were the left. And then in about the 60s and 70s in the United States, right up through the 90s, that wasn't true anymore. A lot of the criticisms of science as an institution, science as a power structure, were from the left. And I remember being confused at the time, thinking, well, this is a real change from the Enlightenment. It didn't take long for the right wing to pick up on those tools and use them for their own purposes. Most post-truth, most science denial these days is from the right. There is still some science denial from the left. It still can be from the left. But what I notice is that we now have what I consider to be right-wing postmodernists. We have people who have read their Lacan and their Derrida, who are right-wing political operatives. And I'm not saying Donald Trump reads that because he doesn't, but there are people who influence folks on the right who he listens to, who have read that. And we're very much in the camp of saying, all truth is narrative. There's no such thing as truth. And if there's no truth, there can't be accountability. That's a very dangerous thing.
The argument that we hear now, Lee, are basically the arguments we heard from the authors from the left 2, 3, 4 decades ago. They're basically the same arguments. Just the topic is changing or changed, but the arguments are, as you said, there's no truth, or who can tell me what is right or wrong, or truth is relative. I still know many professors here in Brazil that they teach science and they emphasize that truth is relative, or it's sometimes I get it saddens me, because how can someone learn science starting by the principle that science is relative, but in the sense of the worst sense of
in the worst sense. I mean, look, I wrote an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, where I have chapters and chapters of criticism of science, things that scientists need to think about, methodologically doing better, I've got a chapter on fraud, but I've also got a chapter on all those things that are just short of fraud, that are just allowed, just barely allowed, and that deserve criticism, that lead to difficulties like p-hacking and irreproducible studies, etc. The thing that I always find so amazing about science, though, is not that it's perfect. It's that when there's a problem, the scientists are the first people to notice it and begin to try to address it. That, yes, science is criticized from the outside, but science is also cleaned from the inside, from people who don't all agree with one another all the time, and want to keep one another honest, even if they were honest in the first place. That's one thing that's why I think science is such a rare activity, because I mean, in some ways, the only heresy in science is fraud. You can say even outrageous things, as long as they're testable, and as long as you're willing to live by the evidence. And when the evidence doesn't come back your way, you say, no, I was wrong. I changed my mind now. That's okay. It's the thing that gets you kicked out of science is fraud. And I think that's interesting, because what is fraud? It's cheating on the ethos behind science, the idea that we live and die by the evidence, and that other people are going to build on our work, and that we in good faith are going to do that because science is so difficult that we need help. So it's cooperative and competitive in that way. I don't know. I still love science as much as I did when I was little, even though I now understand some of the warts. But part of my writing is to help to get past that, because it's a unique activity.
And I think one important part of the work of philosophers like you, or contemporary philosophers of science, is to criticize certain aspects of science without destructing science. This is what, for me, my impression of postmodernism is that they tried, instead of offering constructive criticisms of science, they tried to like throw the baby out of the bathwater, because they just
sometimes
pretty much everything without, as you said, there are many things to criticize in scientific research, in the way scientists conduct their inquiries, but you must be reasonable to do this kind of criticism.
Yeah.
Talking about your books, Respecting Truth was published in 2015.
Yeah.
And in the book you discuss a concept called willful ignorance.
Yeah.
How can someone be willfully ignorant about something?
Yeah, I didn't invent that word. It's that phrase. It's an interesting phrase, though, isn't it? Because I guess I think of it this way. It's one thing to know that you know. It's one thing to know something. It's another thing to know that you know it. So if you believe that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are good vaccines that can help us from getting COVID, that are protect us to a certain level, you know that, you believe that. Then you've got the people who I think are deluded, the people who, have been misled, the people who just, really don't, someone has lied to them. Between those two, I think are a category of people who are what I think of as willfully ignorant. That is, they could learn, they could gather the evidence and come to a better conclusion, but they don't want to. So it's not that they have researched it, been misled, and believe a falsehood. It's that maybe it's convenient for them to believe the falsehood. And sometimes these are the people who are even more culpable than the hardcore deniers, who are victimized. Because what I think of here are, think about the scientists who worked for ExxonMobil in the 1970s, who knew that climate change was real, who had some of the best data and evidence in the world, but then were perfectly complicit with their company covering that up and even donating money to think tanks that were fighting, against the idea that climate change was real. I mean, I'm not even sure that's willful ignorance. That's just corruption. But you do have willful ignorance in people who probably in that same category, who they don't want to know, right? They suspect that maybe it's real and there's some data that they could look at that would confirm that, but they don't want to look at that data, because if they look at that data and it comes out the wrong way, then they would have to believe something that they didn't want to believe. And that's an example of when your identity is on the line, or your ideology, where you just, you already know what you want to believe, and science had better not mess with it, because you're either going to pretend it's not true, which is willful ignorance, or you're going to get yourself into such a state of, openness to lies that you really don't believe that it's true. I sometimes think that it's the people who are the willfully ignorant that are the most culpable, because they half know and they half don't.
When we talk about scientific concepts, the willfully ignorant are perhaps science deniers, or can be regarded as science deniers.
Well, science denial is on a spectrum, right? I mean, they're the people who are, I hate to use the word to give it currency, but it's true. There are some people who are vaccine hesitant, right? Who they're scared. They don't know enough. I'm going to draw an important distinction here, because their science denial exists on a spectrum, right? You've got the hardcore deniers who are never going to change their mind, and then the ones who you maybe could change their mind with facts, but they don't have the facts, sometimes because they're willfully ignorant. I want to draw a distinction there between them and the people who are just the liars, the people who are creating the disinformation, that is causing science denial in the first place. Because I think there sometimes you have people that it's not even correct to say that they're willfully ignorant or that they're deniers. They're corrupt. There are people who are creating myths and disinformation in order to delude people. I'm thinking here of the cigarette companies, the tobacco companies, making up, pretending that cigarettes didn't cause cancer or saying it was in doubt long past they knew that it wasn't in doubt. I mean, that's sort of intentional. And here's where I draw the distinction, right? That sort of intentional pursuit of lies, knowing it's going to have a bad effect, but not caring. I'm not even sure that's denial. I think that's treachery.
Yeah.
I think that's the ninth circle of hell. I mean, that's bad.
Yeah.
People's lives are at stake. And, that happened with the vaccines too. I hear all the commentators on TV talk about how, well, where did all this misinformation come from? And I yell at the TV set, it's not misinformation, it's disinformation. Stories were made up because it was in somebody's benefit. And you wonder, whose benefit could that be? And I can name them. I can talk about it if you want, because some of the disinformation about COVID was intentionally created to create denial, and millions of people died. And it's horrible that it happened, but it's true.
Yeah. Lee, about the denial of science, or how do you think someone become a science denier? You said about perhaps having a conflict of interest, someone who works for
that
tobacco
gets them prepared for it.
Yeah, but what is the typical profile of someone who can be labeled as a science denier?
Lack of trust.
I mean,
science. Some people are just naturally not trusting other people. Some people can be created, can be forced to distrust other people, right? It can become cynical over time. But I mean, the thing that I've noticed the most with deniers is it's not that they lack facts, it's that they lack trust. Because if they have a wrong idea and good information is available, why is it not getting through? It's because they don't trust the people who are sharing the ideas with them. And that, again, and I hate to keep harping on the same thing, but that is a twin goal of disinformation. If somebody is beginning a propaganda campaign, say that the vaccines are dangerous, they've got two jobs. One is the same job that the cigarette companies did, to raise doubt, right? To get you to believe a falsehood. But then there's something even more virulent. It's to polarize, to destroy trust. The cigarette companies only wanted to sell cigarettes. The people who are creating disinformation about COVID, they want political power. That's even worse, right? Because then you're playing on the human propensity to believe that what people tell you is true, and we're all that way. We're a very social species. You think about, packs of wolves, they're not that big. You think about all these other animals you say you're in zoology, right? So you know this. But human beings live in cities of millions of people, and we don't routinely kill one another. I mean, it happens, but it makes the news. How is this possible? It's because we're a very social species. We get along really well on the whole. And so we trust one another and we believe one another. And somebody can tell me a lie and I think, wow, isn't that interesting? It doesn't occur to me until later that it's a lie. So, and people exploit that.
Yeah, and perhaps, Lee, this is what you've written about in your book about science denial, regarding flat Earth, for example. Yeah. It's difficult to understand how can someone believe such an idea like that, but having the social community of people who believe the same is something that helps people to get into the idea and to keep believing it, I think. You've written Lee, in your book, you went to a flat Earth conference and had a conversation with the main speaker. You detail in your book the interaction you had, and interesting that everything you said to him that could be regarded as evidence against flat Earth, or even ways to test his belief in flat Earth, were quickly dismissed by the man. Do you think it's possible for people to reconsider their beliefs when these beliefs are part of their identity?
Yes.
Like, for example, this guy was a flat earther who lives with people who usually connects with people who are also flat earthers.
Yeah, I do believe it's possible. I didn't succeed in converting him or the other folks there, but I do believe that it's possible. And the reason I believe it's possible is because I've read many accounts where it happened, where hardcore science deniers whose identity was on the line changed their mind. And the interesting thing to me is, how did that happen? It didn't happen because of an argument or that a scientist shared the facts, or that somebody finally convinced them they were stupid or something. What worked? I mean, I love these cases. I love reading about these. The thing that works is when they're approached with friendship and respect and patience, someone who listens to them, because that breaks down the wall of distrust, that enlarges your world a little bit. Maybe your identity is made up with all the people who already agree with you, but then there's this person face to face, and that same thing that I just talked about a minute ago, how we kind of like other people and talk to them and enjoy their company. If somebody's standing right in front of you and they're not on your team, but they're standing there talking to you long enough, pretty soon they're kind of on your team. I mean, it's just a way, the really mean comments are anonymous, behind, in a commentary on a Washington Post article where nobody has to see your face. But if you're in a crowd of people, you don't spit in the eye of a stranger and scream at them, tell them they're stupid. You just don't do that. And so just something about human interaction increases trust. And I find that very hopeful. Yeah. And I can cite you many, and you probably know these from the book, I can cite you many cases in which this has actually worked. And it's a beautiful thing when it works.
But I imagine it is also a spectrum of people who are more prone to listen to arguments, and on the other extreme, people who are very close, they really don't want to listen to, or at least initially it's
That's right,
to reach them. I think it also takes time, perhaps for some people a lot of time.
You're right about that, and that's in large part why I failed, because I was at the Flat Earth Convention for 48 hours and then I went home, and I didn't go home with anybody's phone number or email or promise to keep in touch, and I should have. Every person that I met there, I should have gotten their well, maybe not every person, but the guy that I had dinner with for 2 hours, the guy that I grabbed when he came off stage, some of the people that I talked with for 45 minutes, I should have gotten their contact information and kept up with them. That's how people get convinced. They don't get convinced in one conversation with a stranger. They get convinced over time when somebody becomes a friend.
And Lee, can you take some details of this conversation you had with the guy? What are what is the evidence that you presented to him, and what were his responses to
so there were a couple of different conversations in the book. Are you talking about the one?
One of the guy was the main speaker. I think the main speaker in the conference. That
there were two.
You invited him for dinner?
That was the one. Okay, yeah. Yes. Now I know who you're talking about. Yeah. Well, he was a fascinating guy. He was young and very intelligent and a good debater. I mean, this guy was formidable. If you think you're going to go in there as a scientist and he's just going to crumble, no. He was teaching, the session that he was teaching was a session on how to convert globalists into flat earthers. You got to be tough to do that. And so he would go out all by himself with a sign, and people would come up to him and he would convert people. I mean, when they were amongst their friends, follow up. And he knew what he was doing. Follow up, watch this video, and then give me a call. We'll talk about it. I mean, he did it the right way. So that's why I had to talk to him, because he was saying the things that I should have been doing, to get people out. He was getting them in. So we went to dinner, and I didn't know him. I thought that, at any point he might get insulted and run away. So I led with my hardest question, which was, what evidence would convince you to change your mind? What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket right now, could convince you to give up flat Earth? And he was smart enough to realize that he had to answer that question. If he said nothing, I would have said, okay, it's a matter of faith, dinner's over, right? But he felt and said, and other people there said too, no, it's not a matter of faith, it's based on evidence. So he understood why that was an important question. So then we had to think, but he couldn't answer it. And that upset him. And so he kept coming up with things that maybe would convince him, and then he'd take it back off the table. Like, well, maybe I'd have to go up in a rocket and look down at the Earth, but no, the windows might be curved, so that wouldn't work. So he kept coming up with things that were not going to satisfy him. And things got really quiet. And then I said, how about if we flew over Antarctica? And he said, there are no flights over Antarctica. And I pulled a thing out of my back pocket. Yes, here's a flight from Santiago, Chile to Auckland, New Zealand. This is a flight. We could take this flight. And he said, have you been on this flight? And I said, no, let's go together. And he agreed to go. And I thought, wow, that's really, wow, let's do it. And, but then we both started to get a little nervous, because I didn't want him to come back from the trip. I didn't want to pay for the trip and have him come back and say the windows were curved. I wanted, to prove it. You can't prove it, but I wanted him to say, you're right.
Show strong evidence that, yeah.
Right. And so I proposed that we take this flight, because it goes over Antarctica, which is, according to the flat earthers, doesn't exist. According to the flat earthers, Antarctica is a mountain range around the perimeter of the Earth, which makes it 26,000 miles. And according to me and science, it's 1,500 to 2,000 miles, depending on which way you go, right? So I said, we need a criteria. If we make it on one tank of gas, then I'm right. If we have to stop for fuel, then you're right. And he shook my hand, and I thought, oh, we're going to get on the Discovery Channel. I mean, this is going to be great. But then he took it back, and he took it back for a very interesting reason. He said, maybe the whole thing is a hoax. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, maybe no plane ever has to stop for gas. And I said, planes stop for gas all the time. No plane can go 26,000 miles on one tank of fuel. It's impossible. And he said, well, maybe all planes can do that. Maybe they never have to stop for fuel. And I said, are you saying that the entire history of aviation since before you and I were born has been a lie to prepare us for the day when I would be sitting here tonight trying to convince you to get on a plane with me to prove that the Earth wasn't flat? And he said, yes. Wow.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. And that ended the conversation, Lee.
Well, it didn't. I mean, we had another hour and a half after that, but I mean, it was kind of the end of the conversation in some ways, because what do you say after that? I mean, he's a conspiracy theorist. I knew that going in, but it was the end of the conversation in this sense. He didn't say so, but I think I could see the look on his face that he couldn't answer my question. My question was, what evidence would convince you were wrong? And effectively, his answer was nothing. Now, we went on to have, because remember, I led with my hardest question, right? So, I mean, that was about the time the salad came. So, we continued the meal and we talked about many, many other things, but we never answered that question.
And did you interact with other people in the conference?
I did. A lot of them. The guy who took the rocket up.
Oh, yeah, the guy who died in the...
Yeah, he didn't. He died a year later, or 2 years later in that same rocket.
He was trying to check for himself?
For himself, to go up in the rocket, look down, and see if the Earth was curved. Now, he only got up 1,600 feet, which is not, you got to go up 60,000 feet to see the curvature of the Earth. But you know what I respected? At least he had the experimental attitude. He wanted evidence. And he said before he went, if I go up and I look down and it's curved, I'm going to tell people. So I've had some respect for that. Tragically, he died in that same rocket a few years later doing that very experiment.
Well, but did other people seem to be more prone to accept contrary evidence among the people you talked with?
No.
During the role, they seem to be as close as the guy you had in with.
Now, there's some selection bias going on. By the time somebody comes to a flat Earth convention, they're pretty hardcore. Plus, they've got 650 other people who believe what they believe, and I'm the stranger, right? So imagine what would happen if right there on the spot talking to me, they said, oh, I was a fool. Let me get out of here. They're not going to do that. But there was nobody who answered that question. I mean, a couple of people said, just give me proof. And I said, I thought you said you were a scientist. I mean, science doesn't prove things. It's not deductive logic. It's not Euclidean geometry. It is based on probability, is based on, warrant given the evidence. So, I can't prove to you that climate change is real, but it's overwhelmingly likely to be true based on the evidence. And by the way, it's irrational to believe something based on worse evidence. There's something in philosophy called fallibilism. We have to admit that a belief is worthy of belief, even though it may someday later be proven to be wrong when it's empirical belief, because it's just kind of the next step from the problem of induction. You got to accept that. They really did not. And the most frustrating thing about that is they had a double standard. My standard to convince them was proof. But when I asked them for any evidence, they really didn't want to give me something that would satisfy me. I mean, they would give me weird things, and I'd say, well, they'd say, well, why is every picture of an astronaut on the moon with the Earth in the background, there are no stars in the sky? That had to be rigged. And I would say it was daytime. The moon, the lunar surface is super bright. I mean, that's why they could take a picture of the astronaut. So can you see the stars during the daytime on Earth? No, you can't. So you can't see them from the moon either. What's your question? They say, no, that was manufactured in a Disney studio. I say, well, that's not, what's your evidence for that? Well, it just was.
Yeah, and did they say the same about all the Earth pictures from the moon, for example, the Apollo 8 picture? And
all of them.
All of them
NASA is a fraudulent organization. They believe that there's a dome over the top of the Earth and that spaceships can't get through the dome.
And do commercial pilots are also part of the
conspiracy?
Conspiracy, yeah, because
scientists, teachers, government officials, pilots, astronauts, all of them.
But these people, all of them, but
they thought Trump was in on the conspiracy because he's a world leader. And they had a photo of him touching a globe, a glowing globe, standing next to some sheikh from Saudi Arabia who both had their hands on the globe. And they thought that this proved that Trump was in on the conspiracy. You think Trump could keep his mouth shut if he knew something like that, right? I mean, there's your refutation. But no, they believed that Trump was in on it. So, I mean, I went in there wondering, are these people fans of Trump? No, absolutely not.
Ideologically, I think they're very diverse.
They were.
If you think, for example, climate denial, usually people, right-leaning people are more prone to deny climate science, for example. But I think flat Earth there is no left.
It's more diverse, yeah. I mean, anti-vax used to be more diverse. Yeah. Used to have a lot more anti-vaxxers from the left.
Yes.
But now it's been politically polarized. In fact, now you have some people, I read a story a few years back of people who had previously been anti-vaxxers, who were left-wing, And in Marin County, California, this was kind of a hotbed of anti-vax about, that the measles vaccine was going to cause autism, and the vaccination rate was very low in Marin County. Well, they went back after COVID, interviewed some of those people, and no, they all now believed in vaccines because they didn't want anybody to think that they were conservatives. So that's really fascinating, isn't it? Right? Because their identity was at stake. Kind of like, oh no, I don't want to be a MAGA conservative. I'm not that kind of anti-vaxxer. Wait a minute, I'm not even an anti-vaxxer anymore.
Yes.
The cognitive dissonance, aligned their beliefs on the.
Well, you don't want to align with your opposite or people from the party. Yeah, that's amazing. Lee, if you have time for a question on pseudoscience, okay?
Sure.
One of the most interesting discussions in philosophy of science is regarding the difference between science and pseudoscience, and you've written about that as well. Probably the most famous approach to the question was the demarcation problem that was proposed by Karl Popper, and who relied on falsifiability, right, to distinguish science from pseudoscience. Nowadays, philosophers of science usually don't understand that Popper's idea tells all the story. You mentioned your book, The Scientific Attitude, and you wrote in that book a concept that you call the scientific attitude as something that may explain the difference between science and pseudoscience. And could you talk about it?
So I'm inspired by Popper. I don't think that Popper I'm not a falsificationist, and I don't believe, like he did, that you can solve the problem of demarcation on logical grounds. I really respect his work. In fact, his work was, I remember the day I became a philosopher of science was the day I read Conjectures and Refutations. I was a freshman in college. I read this and thought, this is what I want to do with my life. This is really fascinating stuff. So I'm very much influenced by Popper, but I don't think that the problem of demarcation as a logical problem can be solved, and which is what Popper tried to do in a very elegant way. But that still leaves the underlying problem of what is special about science, because the whole reason you want to solve the demarcation problem is because you want to say, well, science is like this and non-science is like this, and here's why they're different. And it's an interesting thing, if you read back in Popper, one point he's trying to solve the demarcation between science and non-science. The later book, he's trying to solve the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. Those are different things. Non-science and pseudoscience are different things. So the problem of demarcation can even shift depending on who you're talking to or at what point you're talking to them, okay? Nonetheless, the foundational question is, what's special about science? And I think that I have an account that works to answer that question, which is that science, and it's not about logic or method, it's about the ethos of science. The scientific attitude, I think, is the idea that scientists care about evidence and they're willing to change their mind on the basis of new evidence. They can all answer that question that the flat earthers could not. What evidence, if you had it in your back pocket, could change your mind? That's the scientific attitude. And then when I thought of that, and this is also based on some work by Helen Longino and Roger Bacon. I mean, it goes back. I didn't invent this. But it seems to me that that's really what cleaves science off. Because, and I have chapters on this in the scientific attitude, I think that's what shows what's wrong with pseudoscience. They don't have the scientific attitude. Or people who commit fraud, or some of the social sciences that are not scientific enough to live or die by the evidence. Once you accept the idea that what's really special about science is the values of science, the ethos, the community ideal, then it's clear why science denial is wrong, why pseudoscience isn't science, why fraud is the worst, form of abuse of science. It all makes sense because it's not about following a method or a recipe. It's about having the right mindset. The mindset that says, I don't know the answer to that. Let's check the data. And if the data tell me I'm wrong, I'll give up my belief. Now, that's very Popperian, what I just said. But I think he had his finger on it. He talked about something called the critical attitude, which before he made it into falsificationist logic, I think was largely right.
And you said Lee, about the scientific ethos and also the organization of the community. Science doesn't depend on only one person. You have
That's
to
right.
you put your ideas to the public, and other people will check it, will verify, will try to refine what you said, even if they don't belong to your generation. You're still, for example, working on the ideas of Darwin, for example.
Yeah.
So this is something I think it's beautiful in science. You can check ideas even decades or perhaps centuries after someone has spoken them out. And even this person who we may regard as the first, he was inspired by others. He built his or her work on the work of other people. It's like science is a community. It depends which people depend on each other. And that, in my opinion, it's something that makes science strong. You can. It's not like you don't need to trust the word of a scientist.
You can check that. That's what I love the way you put that, because I think that's what's wrong with a lot of science education, at least in the early grades. They teach it that there are these individual geniuses who came up with these great ideas. They discovered the truth, and we should just study the content of what they came up with. But as you say, it's more of a community, because, scientists check one another's work. Scientists they build on one another's work because they know that they have the same values. And that, again, that's why fraud is so terrible, because that's a person who has betrayed the values of science. So, by the way, it's the same way for having the scientific attitude. Some people, when I first came out with this, said, well, wait a minute, there are many scientists who don't have the scientific attitude. There are some, but what I'm saying is that the community as a whole has the scientific attitude. The scientific attitude is a creed that it defines what it means to be a scientist. And if if individuals don't have the scientific attitude long enough, they're in big trouble. Even if they're not committing fraud, look what happened to the guys with cold fusion. They weren't committing fraud, I don't think. I've actually written about this a little bit. I don't think they were committing fraud, but boy, they sure didn't want to change their mind even when the evidence didn't go their way. Why not? They went through a very difficult time with that because other people checked on them. It didn't take the profession very long, I think a couple of months, before they blew that out of the water.
There is I'm not with your book here, Lee, because I'm in Canada. I left your books. I have almost all of them, but they are in my house in Brazil. But there is a passage in Scientific Attitude that you say something like that the science as an institution is stronger or is more reliable than the scientist. So
that's true.
What makes science trustworthy is that we rely on a community of people that check ideas, not only the word of one scientist or two.
I think that's right, because even if you're pure of heart, you still like your theory best. You still want your theory to be true. And it's interesting that I think part of what keeps scientists checking their own theories, they don't want to be humiliated by another scientist proving them wrong, right? So why would you be hard on your own theory? Because you don't want to be made a fool of. And then there are all these inspiring examples of times when scientists spent their entire career working on an idea that later turned out to be wrong. And they say, what do you know? I was wrong. And this new person came along and blew their whole career out of the water, but they admit it. That's so noble to me, to be able to do that, to have such respect for evidence, that it's not about your status or how long you've been working on it. It's what do the data say?
Yeah, and I think this also should be included in science classes. People, as you mentioned about the lonely genius, the myth of the lonely genius. We should discuss that more often, and also should discuss perhaps the limits of science, or
Yeah.
you mentioned fallibilism before. I think this is also an idea.
Yeah. Oh, the mistakes.
Yeah.
The mistakes, the failures, that's how you learn about science. How many times, what did Edison say? I've found 500 ways not to make a light bulb. I mean, that's what's really important, I think, for kids to learn. These guys weren't just a genius from the moment they were born and they never made a mistake. And then one day they did this great work. There were a lot of setbacks along the way.
Well, yeah. Lee, a last question, okay? You have a book that is coming in September this year, 2023, Truth Killers. May we regard it as a kind of sequel to your previous books about truth and science denial?
It is, in some ways, a sequel to my book, Post-Truth. Because what I noticed in doing the work, thinking about a pattern in my books, Post-Truth, Scientific Attitude, How to Talk to a Science Denier, what I noticed is that, and you see this even back in Post-Truth, that I make the argument that science denial is what paved the way, along with postmodernism and cognitive bias and the internet and decline of the newspapers, other things. But 70 years of really successful science denial is what paved the way for somebody like Trump to lie about the things he was lying about, which think of as reality denial. And so one day I started to wonder, is it just exactly the same problem? Are science denial and reality denial the same? And I think they are largely the same, which means that you can fight them maybe in the same way. And, especially after January 6th, 2021, I started to think that's a denialist campaign. It was other things and, propaganda, almost a coup, but it started with the big lie, just like the lie about vaccines or, about anything. And so I think that what happened is that Trump, who many people dismiss as an idiot, but he's quite intelligent about propaganda. I think he noticed he couldn't help but see the success of science denial and think, if they can lie about that, I can lie about this. I can lie about anything, and did. And I think that he borrowed a lot of the disinformation tactics from the former Soviet Union that are still active in Russia today in their intelligence service and uses those. I think that Trump is responsible for the first domestic disinformation campaign in the history of American politics. That's what the new book is about. So, no, it's not a mystery, Truth Killers, it's not a mystery. Trump, Putin, that's who's responsible. But it's also about all the other threads of how we got to this point. And by the way, the book has just been retitled. It's now called On Disinformation. I kind of liked the title Truth Killers, but the publisher was a little worried that it sounded like a novel. So it's going to be called On Disinformation, and it's a short little manifesto. I hope it does well. But it completes the argument from those other three books to now say everything I said about science denial is also true about reality denial. And then I give some tips at the end for how to fight it based on how scientists fight science denial.
Yeah.
And I hope that's all I have to say about it, because I want to do other projects than just keep writing about people who are resisting truth.
But are you writing about other topics at the moment, or you're still working on?
Well, right now, that book, Truth Killers on Disinformation, is in proofs right now, and so I'm still thinking about it. I'm still writing a paper that I'm going to give, when I get out on the road to support the book, and I don't know what comes after that. I really don't. I've been at the same topic over 4 different books for 8 years now, and I maybe want to do something new, and I don't know what it is yet. But the world keeps getting to be a kind of a worse place, and so what do you write about? That's not true. Maybe now, I don't know. It looked that way when I when Trump was in office. Now, and Bolsonaro now no longer.
Yeah, no longer
in
Lee,
Brazil.
If you have like 2 minutes, I want to get back to a topic that we were discussing before.
Sure.
Maybe this one is the last question.
Sure.
Talking about science denial as well. People deny certain scientific conclusions, but not most of them. People take science for granted in certain topics. People take planes, people get drugs, medical drugs, people trust doctors. What are the characteristics of the ideas that make people prone to make this? Sorry, let me ask again. What are the characteristics of certain ideas that make them prone to be denied by some people? Is it like a feature of science denial? Is more a feature of the conclusion or the person who believes the conclusion?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that one. All I could really say about that is this. You're right that there are very few people who are anti-science. They just hate all science.
Yeah.
They tend to be selective. And what I call them are cafeteria skeptics. In a cafeteria, you go through and you take a little bit of what you want and you leave everything else. I think that's what they do with science. They say, oh, I really like chemotherapy. I like my doctor. I like flying on planes, but I don't like flat Earth. I don't like the idea that the Earth is round, and I don't like vaccines. So they'll go through and they'll pick. And how do they choose? How do they pick? I think, and I hadn't really thought of this before the most recent book, the book that's about to come out. It's a little bit on it, and I guess I was percolating in how to talk to a science denier. It's because those are the topics on which they are radicalized. If you think about the topics of science denial, they are all topics that somebody else's interests are at stake. Who benefits from denying that cigarettes cause cancer? The tobacco companies. Who benefits from denial of climate change? The fossil fuel companies. Now, here's a tough one. Who benefits from anti-vax? A lot of the anti-vax disinformation during the pandemic came out of Russian intelligence. Now, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, except there's evidence for this. The State Department and the Department of Defense and, did reports on this, and there's evidence even in mainstream media, in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about this. The only one I could never figure, and obviously evolution, what's the interest there? Religion. I mean, there's always somebody that's benefiting financially, politically, ideologically from science denial, and they create disinformation. They create lies in order to radicalize people because it's in their benefit. It's really cynical, horrible, right? People died of COVID because of propaganda that came out of Russia that was intended to destabilize Western confidence in Western science, and to make it more likely that the Sputnik 5 vaccine would be the one sold all over the world rather than, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. That's why it was done. The one exception is flat Earth. I've never been able to figure out who makes any money on that, whose political or ideological interest. I can't figure out who would create disinformation about it. That one I've never figured out. The other ones, I think it makes sense. We have denialist beliefs on the topics on which it serves someone else's interest that we have denialist beliefs.
Yeah, well, Lee, thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It's a pleasure to
My pleasure.
We've met on SciCon in Vegas in last October. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. And congratulations on your work. Your books are great. It's a pity that we don't have them in Portuguese so far. So
you do have some of them,
but the latest ones, not in Brazil, in Brazilian editions. I have a Brazilian edition of.
I'll check with the person who handles the translation, because I think there might be one that's
perhaps in Portugal, but not in Brazilian editions.
Is it it's a different language?
No, it's the same Portuguese, but we usually the books we get in Brazil are edited in Brazil, and we
edited in Brazil. Okay, because I knew that it was the same language. I thought maybe it was
the same language, but usually different editions. We have like a Portuguese edition in Portugal and a Brazilian edition in Brazil.
Yeah,
and I don't think we have Brazilian editions of your books, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we'll put a stop to that, right? One of my good friends is Natalia Pasternak, so. We'll I'll talk to her and ask her advice on the publishers there. And thank you for reminding me. Yes, we did meet at SciCon, and thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for reading so much of my work. That was terrific. I usually am not talking to somebody who can move from one book to the other. That's very flattering to me. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, Lee, and a pleasure again.
Thank you.
Thank you.